Catchment Combos with Thriving Southland, your link to Southland catchment groups and their impactful projects. Each episode will dive into grassroots effort by local farmers and communities that are driving change and sustainability in our regions. Listen in for inspiring stories and insight. Real people, real change, the Southland way. In today's episode of Catchment Combos, we're celebrating the evolution of Thriving Southland and diving into the role it plays into transforming our rural communities. Today's guest has been an integral part of that journey, Kate Scott, who many of you may know is our Deputy Chair. Kate has been with Thriving Southland from its very beginnings, helping shape it into what it is today, a network of passionate catchment groups working to protect and enhance our landscapes and rural sector. Kate brings a wealth of experience in the agribusiness sector. Currently, she's the Executive Director of environmental consultancy firm LandPro, and more recently, she has been appointed CEO of Horticulture New Zealand. She's played a key role on New Zealand's Rural Leadership Trust and is a Nuffield Scholar. As someone deeply involved in Thriving Southland's growth, she has seen firsthand how catchment groups have created positive change across our Southland region. In today's conversation, we'll explore Kate's insight on how Thriving Southland has evolved, the surprises along the way, and what the future holds for catchment groups and their potential influence. We'll also talk about the value these groups bring and how Kate's time on the board and our project panel has shaped her thoughts moving forward. Welcome to the show, Kate.
How are you, Rach?
Good, thank you. Hey,
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining me today. So, like I said earlier, we're talking to Kate with her Thriving Southland hat on as she is looking to move in her big new role with HortNZ. So we thought we'd have a bit of a conversation with you and talk to you about, since the beginning, you've been involved and, curious to hear your thoughts about how you've seen Thriving Southland evolve over the years since you've been involved.
Yeah, thanks, Rach. And look, it's one of those things that I'm a little bit sad to be coming to the end of my time with Thriving Southland because it's been, as you say, one of those journeys right from the beginning. But when I look at where we started, all those years ago, there was a collection of us who had this real, passion and view for how do we actually enable our farmers in Southland to actually deliver on these challenges in front of them by giving them the skills and the tools to do it for themselves. And that passion remains the same today, and that's pretty amazing. But in terms of as an organisation, we really have evolved from just a few of us volunteering to try and get things off the ground to now having an amazing team of people and a really enduring organisation, we hope, that can continue to bring about benefits, support the change, and actually really show that leadership that we need for the whole of the primary sector to be able to deliver on those challenges, particularly in the environmental space. But also, I think Thriving Southland has evolved to being this national leading voice and showing leadership nationally, which in my view is not what we anticipated when we started all these late night meetings chatting about what it could be. But I think that's just a real testament to the commitment that everyone who was there right from the beginning has shown to Thriving Southland and the value that it adds.
And yeah, that's such an interesting thought, isn't it? Because you think back and do you guys sort of say 2018, 2019, this initial?
It took a while to get through kind of those initial conversations and then trying to get funding, and then COVID got in the way. But yeah, about 2019.
And you think about the rapid pace of change that has hit this province and this sector, it is something to how you guys had that mindset back then to see what it could have been now. Like, you swear you had a crystal ball.
Well, look, it's really interesting you say that. So I, in 2019, had not long finished my Nuffield, and my Nuffield report was looking at how do we kind of drive this change from the ground up rather than the top down. And Huey got in touch with me to have a chat about that, and that's kind of where my involvement started. And bless Huey, I think he's still probably only one of the 5 or so people who actually probably bothered to read my report. But I was really grateful for the opportunity to be able to be involved in a sector and in a community that I, really love and feel like Southland is certainly my second home.
And we've been very lucky to have your time too, Kate, because you wear so many different hats. It helps us with that primary purpose of not duplicating and, of course, bringing in information to learn and hopefully bring it to Southland. So when you first started this journey and then, now here we are today, is there like a couple of things that have surprised you or maybe ways Thriving went that you didn't think they initially would?
Yeah, look, I think probably what surprised me a little bit has been the success that we've been able to gather. And I think that's because we probably didn't really sit back and imagine where it might get to. It was just the how do we deliver wholly for our farmers and our catchment groups, because there was so many challenges and roadblocks, and we all kind of felt that we had to do something to help that journey. The success of it has probably been one of those amazing surprises, and one of the things that I will take away with me, that it's been really amazing to be part of such a really tight-knit group. And that's probably the other thing, that the reason I've been here for 5 years is because it's such a great group of people to work with, and that doesn't always happen when you're involved with groups and organisations. And so I think that's not a surprise because they're all a great group of people, but that's one of the really wonderful outcomes that you can take away from being involved with Thriving Southland.
Hey, look, from the ground side of things and the operational, we feel that way about our team too. And we know that a lot of our catchment group members feel the same, that they're in it for the right reason. And credit to the board, because, always lead by example. So we've always felt that from you guys. So kind of the fundamental of Thriving Southland is supporting catchment groups. And how or why do you think they have been successful? Or what are some of the key things you've seen make a successful catchment group?
Yeah, look, I'm a really strong advocate for catchment groups. I think they've got a hugely important role to play in terms of not just how we navigate, that regulatory change piece that's in front of us, but also I think for me, the role that they play in their local communities. When we look at how hard, life gets and how busy everyone gets, having that connection to community and people rallying around a common cause, which is looking after their communities, is in my view the real key to their success. And what we see is that they usually start with one or two really keen individuals who then kind of get everyone else to wrap around them. And I think that's probably one of the challenges that catchment groups have, is how do we keep all of our volunteers and our people who are working really hard not overwhelmed or overworked by the burden that can come with what's being asked of catchment groups. That is a challenge in my view, but I certainly think the success comes back down to putting community at the heart of what they do.
And yeah, those challenges and questions will probably remain unanswered and or always questioned for a long time to come as different people get involved, different challenges become presented. And if this spring has taught us anything, your community is really important and making it through. Moving into sort of a different little bit of topics, catchment groups seem to find themselves talking a lot about regulation at the moment. So what do you think, or where do you think catchment groups sit from a regulatory sort of space?
Look, that's a really good question. And I think I'll try and answer it in two parts for you. The first part is that, yes, catchment groups have a role to play in the regulatory space in terms of how do they actively engage with their councils to understand what plan changes, what rules, what directions might be coming. I think they're a really good gateway to connection between the people that sit in the regulatory buildings and the farmers and the growers on the ground. So that's one aspect. So how do they be that connector or joiner between the realities of having to apply regulation, but the practicalities of how it needs to work in the ground? So I think that is a really important role for catchment groups. I do worry, though, when I start to see that catchment groups being seen as being either the enforcer, the compliance people for communities or around the regulations. I think that's something that really bothers me. That's not their role. We're talking about a group of people who are here to enable, not to actually deliver compliance and enforcement. So that worries me if we see a shift in that direction. I think the role that catchment groups can play in the regulatory space moving forward is when we look at some of these big changes that we're going to have to bring about in terms of managing our impacts in terms of water quality, whether it's some future iteration of farm plans. I think there is a need to take a catchment-based approach. And again, I think catchment groups in that scenario become a good vehicle for how do we collectively work together to solve some of these problems, and the role that Thriving Southland has played in terms of bringing science and knowledge to catchment groups to inform that in my view, a best example of how catchment groups should work alongside regulation, but they shouldn't be the deliverer of regulation, if that makes sense. It's obviously my personal view, but I think that's how you get the best outcomes, because we know we're going to have to work together as catchments and subcatchment into the future to be prosperous, and that is often best done by communities, but we have to kind of work collaboratively, whether we're talking about, council, we're talking about iwi, we're talking about farmers, we're talking about community. There's a real need, and I think that's sometimes the catchment group becomes the vehicle that allows us to come together around that, and it can be an easier place to have a conversation without the challenges of regulation and the conflict that can sometimes inadvertently lead to.
And that farmer to farmer learning is it's awesome to be around, because you can see people validate things really quickly, and they can share their experiences that they've been through. And yeah, regulation's only one of the things.
To my way of thinking, the regulation is really the backstop. If we want to make the biggest changes, it's how we make those small changes and incremental changes, because if we add them all up, they actually result in some big changes. And you're completely right that actually, connecting with others who are trying to solve the same challenges not only gives us a little bit of hope that everyone's trying a lot of different things and we might find a good way to do it, but also when we have some of those failures or those adverse times, we've also got people that we can depend upon. And you just have to look at the terrible spring that Southland has had, and yet every time I talk to farmers out there, almost every one of them has mentioned the change that they've seen in their communities compared to this sort of event happened in the last 20 years. There wasn't that same degree of people reaching out to check if others were okay and trying to help out. And I'm confident that catchment groups have had a real part in supporting that building of community and that how we come together. And I think that's a kind of an unintended upside of what comes when we can enable this sort of approach.
Yep. And wet weather and extreme events and adverse kind of something that everybody has to deal with, and it doesn't matter what kind of thing you're farming or what you've done in the past, everybody's kind of on the same playing field, which, like you said, is a great place to bring people together, although for a really average kind of reason.
100%.
Yeah. So just kind of maybe picking up on a little point there, how important is it that catchment groups stay independent?
Yeah, look, I think catchment groups need to be independent, because there has to be the space for them to be able to delve into their own issues and challenges. I think if you actually bring them into a position that's compromised, then the credibility and the gains that they're making may come into question. And I think keeping them as standalone or independent, in my view, is the only way that they're actually going to function fully into the future. Otherwise, they might be seen as being an arm of council or a subcommittee of something else, and that creates this potential for mistrust or misalignment in purpose, which I just think will undermine the successes that can otherwise be achieved. And the second part of that is, I think catchment groups need to be self-determining. They need to lead for themselves, because every one of them will have a different perspective. And so we can't take over and tell them what to do. And we've been really clear about that from a Thriving Southland perspective right from the beginning, that our role is to enable and facilitate that connection to knowledge, rather than being the ones telling them what to do. And I think personally, when I look across the catchment group landscape, that's a really big part of Thriving Southland's success.
Yeah, and we are really proud to say that. And so that's, for everybody who doesn't know, Thriving Southland very much sits beside catchment groups, and we're there to help when catchment groups want. And yeah, connect, as I liked that saying, connection to knowledge, trying to figure out who are the people who know the stuff. And I guess changing to maybe a little bit of a side bit that you do for Thriving, Kate, is you sit on our project panel. So Thriving Southland has an independent project panel that reviews and evaluates all of the projects that come into Thriving for them to fund. So catchment groups submit their applications for a project, and this project panel of 4, including Kate, looks over them to decide if they fit into the sort of the criteria. And I guess in your time in this panel, what are your sort of key thoughts or key takeaways from all the projects that you've seen come across the desk?
Yeah, I have to say that's been one of the fun parts of our job on the project panel, because we kind of get to delve quite deeply into what each of the community groups are looking to do. And we always have some really robust conversations around whether the projects are aligned to the funding objectives, which out quite clearly. And I guess there's the novel projects that stand out when you look at one of the groups who were wanting to look at novel ways to utilise pivot irrigators for, was it mobile feeding opportunities?
Yep, mobile wintering shelter.
Yeah, so that's the novel end of the spectrum, but it's also really great to see the outside of the box thinking. And then we come to some of our really big projects like Tower Catchments One, and looking at the likes of the Balfour project. They're all projects that stand out as having not only added huge value to their local catchment groups, but actually adding huge value to Southland when we start to actually look at how do we manage land use change, how do we evaluate what we can or can't do, and the impact of those mitigations that we might be able to deploy within our farms. And so there is such a spectrum, and those are the things that probably stand out for me, that the robustness of the conversations at that table are fantastic. And some people might think it's from the outside a pretty straightforward process. You just fill in a form and off you go. But those projects that have been through our group, we often will go back and ask for further information, and that's probably a bit of a frustration at times for everyone. But that's because we also feel like we have a duty to be really responsible for the funding that's going out, so that we can hand on heart show that it's creating impact that's not just, community impact, but also region-wide impact. And I think we've done a pretty good job of that. If I'm going to give ourselves a pat on the back for something, that would definitely be it.
Oh, I think it's a deserved pat on the back, Kate. And we as Thriving are really proud of that project panel, because it helps that, like you said, making sure that the money is spent wisely and valuably, but equally so those groups, when they have the idea and they have the motivation, that they're able to submit an application that is relatively simple, we think, but they need a bit of information if we're going to give them some money. And you guys are really quick to respond and, ask questions that are actually just challenging them in ways that maybe they haven't thought about, or things that you guys know that they haven't looked at. And they can get a response really quickly, which means these projects are happening within a really short time frame, which is a little bit of a rare gem sometimes in the funding world.
Look, I think without that, we certainly wouldn't have had the successes that we've had. And I think otherwise funding is so hard to access. And you look at the moment, all community groups and organisations are struggling to find funding for stuff. And so I think we've been really fortunate to have been able to commit our funds to the on-the-ground science, knowledge and tools. And you just have to look at some of the field days or the follow-up extension events that come at the back end of almost every project, because that's a requirement that we want to see how the knowledge that's been gained is going to be shared widely. You just have to look at the attendance at some of those events. There is so much interest from a really broad range of our sector, and that's not just our farmers on the ground, but it's also our rural professionals and our bankers and our regional council people. They've been really interested in it. So we've had a really great sense of buy-in, I think, across the whole. Industry bodies have played a big role in it. So it's that sense of collaboration, I think, is a big part that comes out of all of this.
Yep. And cross-sector engagement, right? Where catchments, It doesn't matter who you are or what you do, your age and stage, your farming practice, catchment groups are for you. So we love that plug. And like you said, sharing the word, that's why we're doing a podcast. So everyone listens and they can learn to all the good stuff. So we can't wait to have more groups on sharing the projects. You mentioned Balfour. Like, all of those guys are all lined up, ready to go. We just got to wait for them to have some time off the tractor at the moment. But hey, so obviously you get to see and talk to loads of people in all your different roles, Kate, but in your time with Thriving, is there some things that you've learnt from the organisation or from catchment groups, or things that you've observed that you're sort of going to take away with you?
Yeah, I have. Obviously, one of the ones that stands out for me is that having a great idea just takes a room full of really like-minded people to actually achieve something. So that's one of them. Bring everyone together, and then you kind of just have to believe that there's a way and you just make it happen. So that's definitely one of them. I think one of the other learnings or observations that stands out for me is having to have a little bit of tenacity when it comes to funding, and a lot of patience, because the wheels of government when it comes to funding can move really slowly, which is a hard thing for a group of farmers who are, let's face it, action orientated and typically doers.
Yeah.
So learning to roll with the process is a good checkpoint to say, well, actually, yes, we can still do it if we actually show perseverance and commitment. And I think just to acknowledge, especially MPI, because we wouldn't have been able to achieve what we've achieved without their support, and remembering that all of the people that work in there have been huge supporters for Thriving Southland as well. I think it's sometimes easy to overlook that, but we are thankful for their support, particularly in the early days when this was a little bit novel. But, we got there. And probably the last thing I would say is just the value of working with amazing people. I'm really fortunate that whilst I'm going to be stepping out, I'm leaving with this big room full of connections, and I'm fairly confident I'm not going to be too far away from what's happening on the ground in Thriving Southland, and have a great new stable of people I would call friends just from being connected so fully for so long across this work.
Oh, of course, Kate, you can't get away from us that easy.
I don't think I will be.
Especially with your new role, we'll be so eager to hear all of the things that you've got to learn, and I'm sure Southland will be able to initiate and engage in all of those different projects that Horton's on. So stepping down from the board officially at the AGM and into your new role at Horton Z. So a bit of a question for you, a little bit curly. Do you believe that Thriving delivers value, and moving forward, what are the opportunities that you see for Thriving Southland and the Southland network of catchment groups?
Yeah, look, if I didn't believe Thriving Southland delivered value, then I wouldn't still be here some 5 years later. And I think Thriving Southland delivers huge value. And for me, I think there's both challenges and opportunities on the horizon. So we talked about before very briefly that challenge of a tight funding environment. And so I think that's the challenge that we need to navigate, is how do we continue to fund the value that Thriving Southland is bringing to the whole of the Southland region. But when I look at opportunities, I see ongoing opportunities for Thriving Southland to be that conduit between the regulation and the people on the ground who have to implement the regulatory piece, and the how do we actually deliver, as I say, science, knowledge, tools, information, and support to actually achieve some of these big things. And I think Southland has actually done a pretty good job as a region when we look at that shift we've seen around that engagement with catchment groups. And the things are not perfect by any stretch, but when you look at it compared to many other regions, Southland are actually showing a real willingness to work collaboratively. And I think that's part of the opportunity in the horizon. So how do we keep building on our strong foundation to deliver Southland specific science? How do we continue to connect all of our stakeholders across Southland? And that's facilitation and the connecting role that I think will only become more and more important. And I think Thriving Southland and the team of people who work at Thriving Southland are definitely the right people to keep delivering on that. If we want to really bring about this change piece, we need champions for change. And I think that's kind of a lens through which I see the opportunity for Thriving.
Hey, it's great to hear, Kate. It was always lovely to get that sort of positive affirmation of things. And I guess when you first started out, we kind of say about 18 catchment groups, and now we're at about 37. So, it's awesome to see them go through their own ebbs and flows, like everything does in life, and all of the great things they've been able to achieve. And yeah, we are really proud of it. But the kudos all goes to those farmers and those catchment group members on the ground who come up with the ideas, who step up and who turn up to the meetings and, make it happen. So, hey, maybe one last opportunity. Is there anything else you sort of wanted to say?
Look, probably the last thing I really would just want to say is just to thank all of the catchment groups for their support. Southland is not, as I said, not my first time. I'm based in Central Otago, although I have whakapapa heritage. My grandparents were both from Invercargill, so do have a strong family history there. But really just want to be able to thank everyone for their support in the time that I've been a part of Thriving Southland. I am genuinely sad about having to step away from the day-to-day, but will continue to be a really big and really loud supporter for all the great work that everyone on the ground is doing. And for me, it just reinforces the feeling that I know that our farmers and our growers are doing amazing work on the ground. And so how do we help them to tell that story of the great work that we're doing so that we can all keep caring for the environment and for the future of our farming and our communities. So yeah, just a big thank you from me to everyone, to the board and to the team at Thriving Southland as well.
That's awesome, Kate, and thank you for your time. And we know you'll be able to keep up to date by being a good listener of Catchment Convos. I know your support is, second to none, and we know that you're always there in our corner, which is so great. And having connections across New Zealand and across the province is, what makes this network so strong. So thank you again for your time, Kate.
No, thanks for having me, Rachel.
And that's a wrap for another episode of Catchment Convos, brought to you by Thriving Southland. A big thanks to our guests for being a part of the conversation on today's episode, and for you guys for tuning in. We appreciate your support. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow us wherever you get your podcast from so you can stay up to date with all the latest episodes as they're released. For more information on this episode, check out the show notes or head to the Thriving Southland website, where you can also learn more about the awesome work happening across the catchment groups here in Southland. And if you've got a project or an idea you want to share, don't be shy, reach out. So until next time, keep up the good work out there on the land, and as always, stay connected and keep driving those changes for a thriving Southland.